In 1885, a packet of arsenic cost 10 cents at any drugstore in America. No signature required, no questions asked. You could buy it on your morning errands, between the flour and the lamp oil. That same year, a 16-year-old bride named Minnie Wallace watched her 48-year-old husband die in agony 1 month after their wedding and walked away with a fortune worth $16 million in today's dollars. She was tried for murder. She wept on the witness stand. And 12 men set her free. She would do it again. This is not a story about one woman or one murder. This is the story of a legal system that gave wives no property, no autonomy, and no exit from a bad marriage, but gave widows everything. And in the gap between those two facts, women made calculations that still disturb us, because arsenic cost 10 cents, and freedom was priceless. Act 1. The Price of a Wife, Chapter 1, 10 cents for a widow's freedom. Before we meet the accused, we must understand the trap that made murder a rational calculation for thousands of women. In the 1880s, a married woman in America did not legally exist. This was not a metaphor. Under coverture law, a legal doctrine inherited from English common law and still active across most American states, a wife's legal identity was absorbed entirely into her husband's. She could not own property. She could not sign a contract. She could not keep her own wages if she earned them. She could not open a bank account, file a lawsuit, or make a will. In the eyes of the law, the woman she had been before marriage simply vanished. The legal term for this was civil death. Now consider the arithmetic. A middle-class wife in 1885 had access to roughly $0 of her own. A divorce, in the rare jurisdictions that permitted one, cost between $500 and $2,000 in legal fees alone. That is between $16,000 and $65,000 in today's currency. She would need her husband's money to leave her husband. And even if she obtained a divorce, the social consequences were catastrophic. Divorced women were barred from polite society, churches turned them away, employers refused to hire them. A divorced mother could lose custody of her children under the prevailing legal stance, which favored the father's household as the more stable home. But a widow was a different creature entirely. Under dower law, the legal counterpart to coverture, a widow was entitled to 1/3 of her husband's estate at minimum. In many states, the figure was closer to 1/2. She regained her legal personhood overnight. She could own property, sign contracts, control her finances, and raise her children without oversight. Society did not shun her. It pitied. It brought her casseroles. It invited her to dinner parties. It treated her with a deference that no wife and no divorcee could ever expect. The math was brutal in its clarity. Divorce cost thousands of dollars, destroyed your reputation, and might cost you your children. Widowhood cost nothing, restored your freedom, and came with a guaranteed inheritance. The only variable was how the husband died. And arsenic made that variable remarkably easy to control. A 10-cent packet of white arsenic from any corner drugstore was odorless, nearly tasteless, and dissolved cleanly in coffee, soup, or medicine. Its symptoms mimicked cholera, gastric fever, and a dozen other common ailments that killed Americans by the thousands every year. Doctors misdiagnosed arsenic poisoning so routinely that toxicologists of the period estimated fewer than 1 in 20 cases were ever correctly identified. The Marsh test, a chemical procedure capable of detecting arsenic in human tissue, had existed since 1836, but it required a suspicious coroner, specialized equipment, and a willingness to challenge the attending physician's diagnosis. In rural America, those three conditions almost never aligned. In a nation of 76 million people, there were fewer than 300 trained toxicologists. This was the architecture. Coverture built the cage, dower rights built the exit, and arsenic was the key that cost 10 cents. No woman proved this more efficiently than Lydia Sherman. Between 1864 and 1872, Lydia Sherman killed 11 people, including 3 husbands and 8 children, with arsenic. She collected 3 estates totaling approximately $25,000, the equivalent of roughly $700,000 today. She moved freely between Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, always the same: a quiet widow, a woman whose misfortune in losing so many loved ones inspired sympathy rather than suspicion. Doctors attributed each death to natural causes. No autopsy was performed on any of her first 9 victims. She was finally caught only because her 3rd husband's family demanded an investigation. Even then, prosecutors could only prove the final murder. The other 10 deaths remained legally unresolved. At her trial, Lydia expressed no remorse. She had simply identified the most efficient solution to the problem the law had created. She was sentenced to life in prison, where she died in 1870. The newspapers called her the Derby Poisoner. But her real legacy was a template, a proof of concept. Arsenic was invisible. The system was blind. And the women who learned to exploit both walked away with everything. The question was never whether this could happen. The question was how often it already had. And the answer to that question was about to walk into a World's Fair on the arm of a man 3 times her age. Chapter 2, The Girl Who Married the Mayor. Minnie Wallace was 15 years old when a 48-year-old Civil War veteran fell madly in love with her at the New Orleans World's Fair. The year was 1884. The Cotton Centennial Exposition had transformed New Orleans into a showcase of Southern ambition. Gas lamps illuminated pavilions filled with industrial machinery, Egyptian antiquities, and a working cotton gin. 33 acres of exhibition space sprawled along the Mississippi River. Visitors numbered in the tens of thousands, arriving by steamboat and rail from every corner of the country. Among them was James Reeves Walkup, a former mayor of Emporia, Kansas, a prominent attorney, and a widower 3 decades older than the girl who caught his eye. Minnie was the daughter of a family that had known better days. Her father, Willis Wallace, was a lawyer without a thriving practice, a man whose ambitions had outpaced his talent and whose finances reflected the gap. Her mother ran a boarding house in New Orleans, a respectable occupation that announced to anyone who understood the social grammar of the era that the family needed the income. The Wallace name still carried a certain faded respectability in Southern society, the residue of connections to old money and old families. But the money itself had long since evaporated, and what remained was a polished veneer over empty accounts. Minnie understood this distinction instinctively. She was beautiful. Observers described dark hair, bright eyes, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She was composed beyond her years, possessed of a conversational ease that made older men feel clever and younger ones feel clumsy. Most importantly, she was acutely aware that charm was the only currency she possessed. In a family of struggling professionals, she was the most valuable asset, and she knew it before anyone told her. Walkup was smitten. He wrote letters after returning to Kansas. He visited the boarding house when business brought him south. He courted Minnie with the single-minded intensity of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Her parents raised no objection. A 15-year-old girl marrying a man approaching 50 was unusual but not scandalous by the standards of the era. Child marriages were legal in most states, and the concept of adolescence as we understand it barely existed. What mattered to the Wallace family was the financial settlement, and James Reeves Walkup was a very rich man. His estate was valued at approximately $500,000. In today's currency, that figure exceeds $16 million. He owned land across Lyon County, held investments in railroad stocks and cattle operations, and maintained one of the finest homes in Emporia. He was a pillar of his community. He had served as mayor, practiced law for decades, and fought in the Civil War. For the Wallace family, the match was not romance. It was rescue. The courtship moved quick. By the spring of 1885, Minnie had turned 16. In July, the couple eloped. The elopement itself raised eyebrows. Walkup's adult children from his first marriage were not consulted. His Emporia neighbors learned of the marriage only when the couple arrived in town. But what disturbed people most was not the age gap, not the elopement, not the haste. It was what happened immediately after the wedding. Walkup revised his will. The new document left the bulk of his estate to Minnie. His children from his first marriage, who had expected to inherit everything, found themselves reduced to token bequests, small sums that amounted to gestures rather than legacies. The revision was completed within days of the wedding, a fact that prosecutors would later describe as the clearest evidence of premeditation, and that the defense would characterize as the natural impulse of a man in love with his young bride. Minnie arrived in Emporia as a stranger. She was a southern girl in a Kansas cattle town, a teenager in a house built for a family she had replaced. The neighbors watched her with curiosity and something close to suspicion. She was too young, too pretty, and too composed. She carried herself with a poise that did not match her age. She smiled at everyone and confided in no one. She toured the house, she met the servants, she examined the furniture, the silverware, the paintings on the walls. She had been married for less than a month, and the clock on James Walkup's life had already started counting down. Hashtag Chapter 3. 1 month to collect a fortune. Within weeks of her arrival in Emporia, Minnie Wallace bought arsenic from a local drugstore and told the clerk it was for her complexion. This was not as implausible as it sounds today. Arsenic compounds were a common ingredient in Victorian beauty products. Women used them in skin creams, face washes, and complexion wafers, small tablets advertised to produce a fashionable pallor. Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenic complexion wafers were marketed in newspapers across the country with testimonials from society women who swore by their effectiveness. The clerk at the Emporia drugstore did not find the purchase suspicious. He wrapped the packet and handed it to the 16-year-old bride without a second thought. He did not record her name. What happened next followed a timeline that would become grimly familiar. James Walkup fell ill in early August, roughly 3 weeks after the wedding. The symptoms began with nausea and stomach cramps, progressed to violent vomiting, and escalated into the agonizing cycle of pain and dehydration that characterizes acute arsenic poisoning. His skin took on a grayish pallor, his fingertips tingled and then went numb. He could not keep food or water in his. Minnie nursed him attentively. She brought him broth. She sat by his bedside through the long Kansas nights, holding his hand while he groaned. Neighbors who visited the sick room described her as devoted, tireless, and heartbroken. He died on August 27th, 1885. He had been married for 1 month and 5 days. He was 49 years old. His 16-year-old wife stood beside the coffin at his funeral and wept. The attending physician initially attributed the death to natural causes. Summer ailments killed men every year in Kansas. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever all produced symptoms similar to those James Walkup had displayed. There was no reason to suspect foul play. But Walkup's adult children, who had watched their inheritance evaporate with the stroke of a pen, demanded an autopsy. They hired their own physician. They pressed the county coroner. And the results were unambiguous. James Walkup's body contained lethal concentrations of arsenic. The amount recovered from his stomach and organs was, in the coroner's judgment, sufficient to kill 3 grown men. Minnie was arrested within days. The trial that followed captivated Kansas and drew national attention. The prosecution built a case of devastating simplicity. Minnie had married a dying man's fortune. She had purchased arsenic. She had been the primary caretaker during his illness, the one who prepared his food and administered his medicine. She was the sole beneficiary of his revival. The motive, the means, and the opportunity aligned with surgical precision. The defense offered a counter-narrative that was both audacious and surprisingly effective. James Walkup, they argued, was a lifelong arsenic user. He had frequented brothels where arsenic compounds were used as folk treatments for syphilis. He had purchased arsenic himself from pharmacies in Emporia on multiple occasions. His history of mysterious stomach ailments predated the marriage by years. His death was the consequence of his own habits, not his wife's ambition. Minnie was a child bride, innocent and bewildered, caught in a tragedy she did not understand and could not have caused. The courtroom performances were extraordinary. Minnie took the stand and wept. She trembled. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She described her love for her husband. She described her horror at his suffering. She pressed a handkerchief to her eyes so often that the fabric was soaked through before her testimony was finished. The court stenographer later testified that her tears blinded him so that he could not see to write. The image of this 16-year-old girl, small and fragile in the witness box, sobbing as she described her husband's death, proved more persuasive than any forensic evidence the prosecution could assemble. The jury deliberated for 52 hours, more than 2 full days. That length tells its own story. These 12 men were not casually convinced of her innocence. They argued behind closed doors. They voted and re-voted. They reviewed the evidence. They argued again. One juror later admitted publicly that he simply could not bring himself to send a young woman to the gallows. It was not that the evidence exonerated her. It was that the prospect of executing a 16-year-old girl was more than his conscience could bear. Another juror reportedly wept during deliberations. The verdict was not guilty. Minnie Wallace walked out of the courtroom a free woman. She was 16 years old. She was worth approximately $500,000, the equivalent of $16 million today. She had been a wife for 35 days and a widow for the rest of her life. She did not return to the boarding house in New Orleans. She did not collapse in relief or gratitude. She went to collect her inheritance. And for anyone paying attention, the education she had received was far more dangerous than any fortune. She had learned that tears were more powerful than evidence, that youth and beauty could neutralize a mountain of proof, that the system was not a machine for finding truth. It was a theater, and the best actress won. Act 2. The machinery of suspicion. Chapter 4. The widow who kept collecting. Most people, having been tried for murder at 16, would have lived quietly thereafter, but Minnie Wallace was not most people. The acquittal freed more than her body. It freed her ambition. With $500,000 and no legal husband to claim it, Minnie entered adulthood with something almost no woman of her generation possessed: independent wealth and the knowledge of exactly how she had obtained it. She left Kansas. She reinvented herself in the way that only the Gilded Age permitted, shedding her past like a winter coat and stepping into a new life of extravagant spending. By 1889, she was in Paris for the Exposition Universelle, the world's fair that unveiled the Eiffel Tower to gasping crowds. The tower rose 1,000 feet above the Champ de Mars, a monument to iron and engineering that drew 28 million visitors in its first year. Minnie was among them. She walked the exhibition halls in Worth gowns that cost more than a Kansas farm worker earned in a decade. She attended dinners at the finest restaurants on the Boulevard des Capuchins. She cultivated a persona that bore no resemblance to the weeping girl in the Kansas courtroom. She was worldly, polished, and magnetic. She spoke with confidence about art, about travel, about the kind of subjects that marked a woman as cultured rather than merely wealthy. She was also burning through her inheritance at a rate that would have alarmed any financial advisor. Paris was expensive. The gowns were expensive. The hotels, the dinners, the social performances required of a woman maintaining a position in Gilded Age society were all expensive. $16 million in modern currency sounds inexhaustible. It is not, when spent without restraint and without income to replenish it. But Minnie did not need a financial advisor. She needed another husband. She moved to Chicago, the roaring center of American ambition, a city rebuilding itself after the Great Fire, with the frantic energy of people who believed that money could solve any problem. Chicago in the 1890s was a city of 2 million souls, of stockyards and skyscrapers, of millionaires and con artists. The line between those last two categories was often invisible. Minnie fit in perfectly. Sometime in the mid-1890s, she met John Ketchum. The details of their courtship are murky, obscured by conflicting accounts, lost records, and Minnie's own gift for narrative control. What is clear is that Ketchum was a man of means, that he fell under Minnie's spell with the same helpless intensity as James Walkup, and that their relationship followed a pattern that should have been recognizable to anyone who knew Minnie's history. They married. Or rather, they appeared to marry. After Ketchum's death in 1897, his brother challenged the validity of the marriage certificate, alleging it was forged. The accusation triggered a court battle that dragged on for months, filling column inches in the Chicago newspapers. But the central fact was beyond dispute. John Ketchum was dead. His symptoms bore an uncomfortable resemblance to those of James Walkup. Stomach ailments. A rapid decline. The agonizing progression from nausea to incapacity to death. And his estate, valued at approximately $200,000, roughly $6.5 million in today's currency, was claimed by the woman who had shared his final months. The parallels were extraordinary. A wealthy man, a charming woman, a rapid decline, stomach ailments that defied easy diagnosis, a will recently revised, and a widow who grieved beautifully and collected efficiently. Minnie won the court battle. She collected the estate, she moved on. The public record goes quiet for nearly 2 decades after the Ketchum affair. Minnie had learned, perhaps, that visibility was dangerous. She settled into the anonymity that wealth could purchase in early 20th century America, where a woman with sufficient money and sufficient discretion could disappear into comfortable obscurity. She did not seek attention. She did not give interviews. She lived well, and she lived quietly. But the pattern had one more iteration. In 1914, a man whose name survives only in fragmentary court records died of cyanide poisoning. He had been in a relationship with Minnie. He had recently revised his will in her favor. The circumstances were suspicious enough to generate a police investigation, but not sufficient to produce an arrest. The investigating officers noted the resemblance to previous cases, but could not obtain enough evidence for charges. Minnie cooperated with investigators, expressed appropriate grief, and was never charged. 3 men, 3 suspicious deaths, 3 estates collected, 0 convictions, a span of nearly 30 years from the first death to the last. The numbers tell a story that no jury was ever asked to evaluate, because no prosecutor ever connected the cases. Walkup died in Kansas. Ketchum died in Chicago. The third man died in circumstances so poorly documented that even his identity remains unknown. Different states, different decades, different jurisdictions. Each death was investigated in isolation. Each investigation ended without charges. The pattern that seems obvious in retrospect was invisible in real time, scattered across a continent and half a lifetime. This was the system's deepest flaw. It was not merely that arsenic was undetectable or that juries were sympathetic. It was that the legal architecture had no mechanism for pattern recognition. A woman could kill in Kansas, collect in Chicago, and kill again in another state without any court ever learning that she had done it before. The machinery of justice operated in sealed compartments, each one blind to what the others contained. There was no national database of suspicious deaths. There was no system for cross-referencing poison cases across state lines. Each jurisdiction was an island, and the water between them was deep enough to drown any pattern. Minnie Wallace exploited that blindness with a precision that suggests she understood it better than the lawyers and judges who maintained it. She was not a criminal genius in the melodramatic sense. She was something more unsettling. She was a rational actor in an irrational system, a woman who had identified the rules of the game and played them with ruthless consistency. But not every woman who found herself inside the same system possessed Minnie's talent for performance, and not every jury was willing to let a woman walk free. Across the Atlantic, in a Liverpool mansion with 17 rooms and a staff of servants. Another wife was about to discover what the system did to women who failed to play their part. Hashtag Chapter 5. The cotton broker's wife had a secret. Florence Maybrick was 18 when she married a 42-year-old cotton merchant aboard a transatlantic steamer, and for 8 years she performed the role of a devoted wife while her husband kept a second family across Liverpool. The year was 1881. The steamer was the Baltic, crossing from New York to Liverpool. Florence Chandler was young, American, and possessed of the kind of vivacity that English society found charming in small doses and threatening in large ones. Her mother, the Baroness von Roques, had married multiple times across Europe and installed in Florence a restless cosmopolitanism that did not translate well to provincial English life. James Maybrick was a cotton broker with offices in Liverpool and Norfolk, Virginia, a man of comfortable wealth and expensive habits. They met on deck. He proposed before they reached port. She accepted, perhaps because she loved him, perhaps because the alternative was uncertainty, and perhaps because she was 18 years old and an ocean crossing is a romantic place to make permanent decisions. The early years of the marriage produced 2 children, James Chandler and Gladys Evelyn, and the appearance of domestic contentment. The Maybritts settled at Battlecrease House, a substantial Victorian property in the Liverpool suburb of Aigburth. The house had 17 rooms, a staff of 5 servants, and gardens that backed onto open fields. Florence managed the household with the diligence expected of a prosperous Victorian wife. She supervised menus, oversaw the servants, entertained guests, and performed every social obligation with practiced grace. From the outside, the household at Battlecrease House looked exactly as it was supposed to look. From the inside, it was a catastrophe. James Maybrick was an arsenic addict. This was not a secret. His friends knew. His business associates knew. His pharmacist knew. He consumed arsenic regularly, sometimes in the form of patent medicines, and sometimes in raw preparations he obtained from chemists across Liverpool. He visited them so frequently that multiple pharmacists could identify him by name. He believed arsenic improved his health, sharpened his mind, and enhanced his sexual stamina. Victorian men consumed arsenic for these purposes with remarkable frequency. It was sold openly as a tonic and a stimulant, and the line between medicinal use and addiction was one that the medical profession of the era was poorly equipped to draw. Fowler's Solution, a popular arsenic-based tonic, sat on the shelves of respectable pharmacies beside cod liver oil and quinine. But James Maybrick's arsenic habit was not the most destructive secret in the household. He maintained a mistress. Her name was Sarah Ann Robertson. She lived with their 5 children in a separate household across Liverpool. Listed in certain legal documents as Mrs. Maybrick, James funded this parallel domestic life from the same accounts that paid Florence's household bills. He had maintained the arrangement since before the marriage and continued it without apology or concealment from everyone except his wife. The servants knew. His brothers knew. The social circle in which the Maybricks moved knew, in the way that Victorian society always knew the things it pretended not to know. Florence's discovery of the arrangement reframed everything she knew about her marriage. The man who presented himself as a devoted husband was living a double life. The household budget she carefully managed, stretching every shilling to maintain appearances, was financing another woman's home, another woman's children, another woman's claim to the Maybrick name. Florence's options were functionally zero. Under Victorian law, a wife could not divorce her husband for adultery alone. She would need to prove an additional offense, cruelty or desertion, and even then, the proceedings would destroy her reputation and cost a fortune she did not have. If she left without a divorce, she forfeited her dower rights and risked losing custody of her children to a husband the law still considered the superior parent. If she stayed, she continued to fund her husband's affair with her own household management. The trap was airtight. The financial dimensions made it worse. James controlled all the money. Florence received a household allowance that she was expected to account for down to the shilling. When expenses exceeded the allowance, which they frequently did because James spent lavishly on Sarah Ann Robertson and her Florence was forced to borrow from moneylenders at punishing interest rates. By 1888, she owed more than £500 to creditors, a sum she had no independent means to repay. She was, in effect, going into debt to maintain a household whose budget her husband was siphoning to support his mistress. By the winter of 1888, the marriage had deteriorated into a cold war of mutual resentment. James drank heavily. He arrived home late, or not at all. Florence grew increasingly isolated, trapped in a foreign country with no family nearby and a social circle that considered it her duty to endure whatever her husband inflicted. The servants at Battlecrease House observed the tension with the attentive eyes of people whose employment depended on understanding the moods of their employers. Every sharp word, every slammed door, every night James did not come home was noted, catalogued, and remembered. Then Florence made the mistake that would unravel everything. She began an affair with Alfred Brearley, one of James's business associates. The relationship was reckless by any standard. It was also, in the context of Florence's circumstances, entirely predictable. She was a woman in her late 20s, trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who openly maintained another family. Brearley offered attention, affection, and the illusion of escape. He was younger than James, attentive in a way James had not been for years, and willing to treat Florence as something other than a household manager. In March 1889, the household reached its breaking point. James and Florence attended the Grand National at Aintree, the great horse race that drew all of Liverpool's society. The grandstands overflowed with top hats and parasols. The betting was fierce. The champagne flowed free. And there, in full view of their social circle, James saw Florence speaking with Alfred Brearley. The conversation was unremarkable. But James's reaction was not. He struck Florence. The blow was witnessed by multiple people. Florence appeared at dinner that evening with a black eye that no amount of powder could conceal. The violence at Aintree cracked the last veneer of respectability. Within weeks, the servants at Battlecrease House had chosen sides, most aligned with their master. Florence was now the adulteress, the outsider, the American wife who had betrayed her English husband. The fact that James had maintained a mistress for the entirety of the marriage did not factor into their moral calculus. His infidelity was a man's prerogative. Hers was a crime against the natural order. And when James Maybrick fell ill in April 1889, the household was already primed to suspect the worst of his wife. Chapter 6, the letter that sealed her fate. A nursemaid named Alice Yap opened a letter that was not addressed to her, and in doing so, she destroyed Florence Maybrick's life. James Maybrick's final illness began in late April 1880. The symptoms were familiar to anyone who knew his medical history. Nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, weakness. He had suffered similar episodes before, the predictable consequences of a body chronically saturated with arsenic. The attending physician, Dr. Humphreys, prescribed conventional remedies and expressed no alarm. James had been sick like this before. He would recover. Florence nursed. She prepared his food, administered his medicines, and sat by his bedside through the long nights of agony. She changed his sheets when he soiled them. She held basins for him to vomit into. She did everything that a dutiful wife was expected to do when her husband lay dying. And in the small hours when the house was quiet and James slept fitfully, she wrote a letter to Alfred Brearley. The letter was not a confession. It was not a murder plan. It was, by all surviving accounts, a lonely woman's attempt to explain her impossible situation to the one person she believed understood it. She described James's illness. She expressed despair about the marriage. She hinted at the financial difficulties that had consumed her. She used language that was intimate without being explicit. She entrusted the letter to Alice Yap, the nursemaid, to post. Alice Yap did not post the letter. She opened it, read it, and brought it directly to James's brother, Edwin Maybrick. The letter's contents confirmed what the servants had already suspected. Florence was conducting an affair. In the feverish logic of a household already divided against her, the leap from adultery to murder was instantaneous. If she was capable of betraying her husband in his bed, she was capable of poisoning him in his soup. The logic was absurd. But it was the logic of the age. James Maybrick died on May 11, 1889. He was 50 years old. He suffered terribly in his final days, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Florence was gradually excluded from his care by his brothers, Edwin and Michael, who had effectively seized control of the household. They searched her belongings. They questioned the servant. They summoned doctors who were sympathetic to their suspicions. By the time James drew his last breath, Florence was already a prisoner in her own home. Within hours of James's death, the Maybrick brothers searched the house. They found flypapers soaking in a basin in Florence's dressing room. Flypapers contained arsenic. Women of the era commonly soaked them to extract the arsenic for use in cosmetic preparation, a practice documented in countless household manuals and beauty guides. But in the context of a dead husband and an intercepted love letter, the flypapers became the centerpiece of a murder case. Florence was arrested and charged with murder. The trial, held at St. George's Hall in Liverpool in August 1889, was a sensation. The courtroom was packed with spectators who arrived hours early to secure seats. The press covered every detail in breathless dispatches that reached newspapers across Britain and America. Florence, dressed in black, sat in the dock while the prosecution constructed a narrative of calculating American treachery. But the medical evidence told a different story entirely. Multiple physicians who examined James Maybrick's body disagreed on the cause of death. The arsenic found in his system was present in quantities that several experts described as insufficient for a fatal dose. 1/10 of a grain was recovered from the body, a trace amount consistent with chronic use rather than acute poisoning. Given James's years of self-medication, his body had developed a tolerance that made the traces found at autopsy entirely consistent with his own habitual consumption. The prosecution's own toxicologist could not state with certainty that the arsenic levels were lethal. There was more. James's brother Michael had sent him a bottle of medicine during his illness. That medicine contained strychnine. No one at the trial explored the implications of this fact with any rigor. The prosecution was not interested in evidence that complicated its narrative. The defense, overwhelmed and underfunded, failed to press the advantage. The strychnine sat in the trial record like an unexploded bomb that no one dared to touch. The case should have collapsed on its scientific merits. It did not. Because the trial was not really about arsenic, it was about adultery. Justice James Fitzjames Stephen presided over the proceedings. He was 70 years old. He was, though this would not be formally recognized until after his retirement the following year, in the early stages of the dementia that would eventually consume him. His cognitive decline was apparent to observers in the courtroom. He lost his place in his notes, he confused names and dates, he rambled into tangents that had no bearing on the evidence, and in his summing up to the jury, he delivered a statement that legal scholars would condemn for more than a century. He told the 12 men of the jury that Florence Maybrick had confessed to adultery. He reminded them that a woman capable of violating her marriage vows was a woman capable of violating the commandment against murder. He drew a direct, explicit line between sexual immorality and homicidal intent. The connection had no legal basis. It had no logical base, but it had enormous emotional power in a courtroom filled with Victorian men who believed that female purity was the foundation of social order. The jury deliberated for 38 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty. Florence Maybrick was sentenced to death by hanging. 38 minutes. In the walk-up case, a jury had agonized for 52 hours before acquitting a woman against whom the evidence was far stronger. In the Maybrick case, a jury needed barely half an hour to convict a woman against whom the medical evidence was contradictory at best. The difference was not evidence. The difference was that Minnie Wallace had wept and trembled and performed the role of innocent girlhood with devastating skill. Florence Maybrick had committed adultery, and in the moral arithmetic of the Victorian courtroom, an unfaithful wife was already guilty of the only crime that truly mattered. The death sentence fell like a door slamming shut on a room from which all air had already been removed, and on the other side of it, Florence Maybrick vanished from the world of the living long before she stopped breathing. Hashtag Act 3, the verdicts that history reversed. Hashtag Chapter 7, 500,000 signatures could not free her. The morning after the verdict, something unprecedented happened. The British public revolted against its own courts. The outcry was immediate, massive, and cut across class lines in a way that stunned the political establishment. Within days of Florence Maybrick's sentencing, petitions demanding clemency began circulating in Liverpool, London, Manchester, Edinburgh, and dozens of smaller cities. Factory workers signed alongside barristers. Housewives added their names next to those of members of Parliament. Shopkeepers who had never expressed a political opinion in their lives took up collection boxes outside their doors. The scale of the response was staggering. Within weeks, more than 500,000 signatures had been collected, a figure that represented one of the largest petition movements in Victorian British history, surpassed in the 19th century only by the Chartist petitions of the 1840s. The objections were not sentimental, they were forensic. Physicians across Britain published letters in medical journals arguing that the evidence did not support a murder conviction. Toxicologists pointed out that the arsenic levels in James Maybrick's body were consistent with chronic self-administration and insufficient to cause death. Legal scholars dissected Justice Stevens' summing up and found it riddled with prejudicial statements that would have constituted grounds for mistrial in a better functioning. One barrister published a pamphlet documenting 17 factual errors in the judge's address to the jury. Queen Victoria herself was reported to have expressed concern about the verdict to her private secretary. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, faced hostile questions in Parliament. The case had become a crisis of institutional legitimacy. If Florence Maybrick could be sentenced to death on evidence this week, after a summing up this prejudicial, by a judge this visibly impaired, then the entire machinery of English criminal justice was suspect. The government blinked. In August 1889, just days before the scheduled execution, the death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Florence would not hang. But she would not go free either. The commutation satisfied no one. Those who believed her guilty thought she should have been executed. Those who believed her innocent thought she should have been released. The compromise was a political calculation dressed as mercy, and Florence Maybrick paid for it with 15 years of her life. She entered prison at 26. She emerged at 41. The years in between were a slow erasure of everything she had been. She was confined first at Woking Prison, then transferred to Aylesbury. The conditions were harsh by any standard. Victorian prisons operated on the principle that suffering was rehabilitative, and Florence's daily existence was one of cold cells, coarse food, enforced silence, and relentless monotony. She scrubbed floors. She sewed mailbags. She was permitted to write 1 letter per month. She received visitors quarterly. The children she had left behind, her son James and her daughter Gladys, grew up without. They were raised by relatives who told them their mother was a murderer. While Florence counted the days in Aylesbury, Minnie Wallace counted her money in Chicago. The contrast is the thesis of this documentary, distilled to its cruelest geometry. 2 women, 2 husbands dead of arsenic, 2 trials held within 4 years of each other on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Minnie, against whom the evidence was strong, walked free. Florence, against whom the evidence was ambiguous, spent 15 years behind bars. The variable was never guilt or innocence, it was performance. Minnie had performed innocence with the instinct of a natural actress. She was young, beautiful, and she wept on command. She gave the jury what they needed to justify mercy, the image of a helpless girl trapped in a terrible situation. Florence had committed the unforgivable sin of adultery. She was older, worldly, and American in an English court. She had not performed the role of the proper Victorian wife, and so the jury saw no reason to perform the role of merciful men. The system did not weigh evidence. It weighed femininity. it measured submission. And by that measure, Florence Maybrick was convicted before she ever entered the courtroom. She was finally released in January 1904 after serving the full 15 years. She was 41 years old. She had entered prison during the reign of Queen Victoria and emerged during the reign of King Edward VII. The world had changed beyond recognition. Electric lights illuminated London's streets, automobiles sputtered along roads that had known only horses when she was last free. Her children were adults. Her money was gone, consumed by legal fees and the costs of maintaining appeals that never succeeded. Her beauty, the one currency Victorian society allowed women to spend, had been spent in prison cells where no one was watching. Florence Maybrick returned to America, the country of her birth, and settled into an obscurity so deep that it amounted to a second kind of imprisonment. She had traded a cell for poverty, a sentence for silence. But the outrage her case generated accomplished something she herself would never benefit from. It planted the seed of systemic reform that would take nearly 2 decades to flower. #, Chapter 8, The Grocer's Wife and the Impossible Poison. Adelaide Bartlett's husband believed married couples should have intercourse exactly once, and that when he died, his wife should be inherited by a clergyman. If the Walkup and Maybrick cases were tragedies, the Bartlett case was something strange. It was a locked-room mystery set inside a marriage so bizarre that the trial transcript reads like a novel that no publisher would accept for being too implausible. Every detail of the Bartlett household was just slightly wrong, like a painting hung 2 inches off center. The furniture was fine. The arrangement was impossible. Adelaide de la Tremoille married Edwin Bartlett in 1870. She was a young woman of uncertain parentage, possibly illegitimate, educated in continental schools that gave her a sophistication unusual for a grocer's wife. She spoke French fluently. She had read widely in philosophy and science. She possessed a quiet intelligence that made the people around her uncomfortable in ways they could not quite articulate. Edwin was a prosperous shopkeeper in South London, the owner of several grocery establishments, a man of rigid opinions and peculiar convictions. Among the most peculiar was his theory of marriage. Edwin Bartlett believed that physical intimacy between husband and wife should occur exactly once, for the sole purpose of producing a single child. After that duty was fulfilled, the marriage should become a platonic partnership, a union of souls unencumbered by the indignity of physical desire. He enforced this arrangement with the earnest inflexibility of a man who believed his own eccentricities were universal moral truths. Adelaide, whatever her private feelings about this doctrine, complied. Their son was born. Physical relations ceased. For years, the Bartletts lived together as intellectual companions in a marriage that resembled a particularly well-furnished monastery. Then, Edwin introduced a third element into the household. Reverend George Dyson was a Wesleyan Methodist clergyman whom Edwin met through his church. Edwin was captivated by the young minister's education and eloquence. He invited Dyson into the family circle with an enthusiasm that struck everyone who witnessed it as excessive. Dyson tutored Adelaide in languages, literature, history, and mathematics. He accompanied the Bartletts on holidays to the seaside. He visited several times a week. He was, by all evidence, more present in the household than many husbands were in their own, and Edwin encouraged it. He told friends and family, openly and without embarrassment, that when he died, he wanted Adelaide to marry Reverend Dyson. He stated this as though bequeathing your wife to a clergyman were no more unusual than bequeathing a pocket watch or a favorite horse. The arrangement was, in Edwin's mind, perfectly logical. He had provided for Adelaide materially. Dyson would provide for her spiritually and intellectually. The fact that Adelaide and Dyson might have developed feelings for each other that were rather less spiritual than Edwin imagined did not appear to trouble him. Or perhaps it did, because in the final months of 1885, Edwin Bartlett's behavior changed. He became possessive. He demanded physical intimacy with Adelaide, reversing the doctrine of celibacy he had maintained for the entire marriage. He grew suspicious of Dyson's visits. The serene triangular arrangement began to crack under the pressure of jealousy, an emotion Edwin had apparently not anticipated when he designed his unusual domestic architecture. The household that had operated on eccentric but stable principles for nearly a decade was suddenly unstable, and the instability centered on the question of who Adelaide Bartlett truly belonged. On New Year's Day, 1886, Edwin Bartlett was found dead in his bed. The cause of death was chloroform poisoning. Liquid chloroform was discovered in his stomach in sufficient quantities to have killed him, and here the case entered territory that would baffle forensic science for a century and a half. Liquid chloroform, when swallowed, burns the throat and esophagus on contact. The chemical is caustic. The pain is immediate and severe. It is effectively impossible to swallow a lethal dose of liquid chloroform without leaving evidence of chemical burns along the entire digestive pathway from mouth to stomach. Edwin Bartlett's throat was entirely undamaged. His esophagus showed no sign of chemical injury. The chloroform was simply there, in his stomach, as though it had arrived by some route that did not involve passing through his body. This was the central mystery of the case, and it had no solution. If Adelaide had administered the chloroform while Edwin slept, pouring it down his throat, the burns should have been present. If Edwin had swallowed it voluntarily in a moment of suicidal despair or accidental ingestion, the burns should have. If someone had injected it into his stomach through a tube, the procedure would have required medical expertise that Adelaide did not possess, and equipment that was never found. Every possible explanation contradicted the physical evidence. The chloroform could not have gotten where it was by any known mechanism. The prosecution charged Adelaide with murder anyway. The trial, held at the Old Bailey in April 1886, was a masterpiece of legal theater. Adelaide's defense was led by Edward Clarke, one of the finest barristers of the Victorian era, who systematically demolished the prosecution's case by hammering relentlessly on the single point that no one could answer. How? If Adelaide killed her husband, how did she get the chloroform into his stomach without burning his throat? The prosecution had a motive. It had opportunity. It had a dead man full of poison. But it could not explain the mechanism of death. And without the mechanism, Clarke argued, the case was a building without a foundation. You cannot convict a woman of murder when you cannot demonstrate that murder was physically possible. The jury acquitted Adelaide Bartlett. The medical establishment was astonished, not because they believed Adelaide was innocent, but because the forensic puzzle was genuinely unsolvable by the science of the day. After the verdict, the eminent surgeon Sir James Paget delivered the quip that would follow the case through history. Now that she has been acquitted, he reportedly said, she should tell us how she, in the interests of science. The line was witty. It was also devastating. It conceded that the finest medical minds of the Victorian era could not explain what had happened in Edwin Bartlett's bedroom. It admitted that a woman had outwitted not just a jury, but the entire scientific establishment. And it acknowledged, with the grudging admiration that clever men reserve for puzzles that defeat, that Adelaide Bartlett knew something that no one else did. She never told. Chapter 9, The Woman Who Became a Ghost. After her acquittal, Adelaide Bartlett did something none of the other women in this story managed. She ceased to exist. The acquittal was on April 17, 1886. Adelaide walked out of the Old Bailey and into the London fog, and from that moment forward, the historical record contains nothing. No address, no occupation, no marriage certificate, no death certificate under her known name, no census entry, no tax record, no letter, no photograph, no mention in any document that has ever been found. She vanished with a completeness that suggests not carelessness but design, not accident but intention. Consider how remarkable this was. In 1886, disappearing was both easier and harder than it is today. There were no databases, no social security numbers, no digital footprints. A person who changed their name and moved to a new city could, in theory, start fresh without anyone in the new location knowing who they had been. But Adelaide Bartlett was not an anonymous woman. She had been the defendant in one of the most publicized murder trials in English history. Her face had been sketched by courtroom artists and published in every major newspaper in Britain. Her name had been spoken in pubs and parlors from London to Edinburgh. She was, for a few weeks in the spring of 1886, one of the most recognizable women in the country. And she vanished anyway. Rumors circulated for decades. She had moved to America and married a wealthy man. She had emigrated to Australia under a false name. She had entered a convent in France. She was living in Paris. She was living in Buenos Aires. She was dead. Every rumor was unverifiable. Every lead, pursued by journalists and amateur detectives and curious lawyers, evaporated into nothing. Researchers have spent more than a century trying to trace Adelaide Bartlett after April 1886, and not one of them has produced a confirmed sighting, a verified document, or a credible witness who saw her after she walked out of the Old Bailey. The most persistent theory holds that she remarried under an assumed name and lived out her life in bourgeois respectability somewhere in England or its colonies. This is plausible. Victorian record-keeping was local and manual. A woman who moved to a new parish, adopted a new name, and established a new identity could have lived undetected for decades. She would have needed discipline, caution, and the willingness to abandon everyone she had ever known. Adelaide appears to have possessed all three. If this is true, she accomplished something that none of the other women in this documentary achieved. She escaped the story entirely. Minnie Wallace lived in the shadow of her past for 70 years. Her fortune built on deaths that followed her through the decades like a scent she could never wash off. Florence Maybrick was consumed by her past, imprisoned by it literally for 15 years, and figuratively for the rest of her life, never able to step outside the identity of the wrongly convicted wife. Adelaide Bartlett simply stepped outside the frame. She refused the role the world had assigned her. She declined to be a character in anyone else's narrative. There is something almost radical about her disappearance. In an era when women existed primarily as characters in other people's stories, as wives, as mothers, as defendants, as objects of pity or scandal, Adelaide chose the one form of freedom that required no permission, no negotiation, and no performance. She chose not to be seen. She chose not to be known. She chose to become no one, and in doing so, she achieved a kind of autonomy that neither wealth nor acquittal nor even innocence could provide. Minnie Wallace was free, but watched. Florence Maybrick was punished and pitied. Adelaide Bartlett was simple. The forensic mystery she left behind remains unsolved. Toxicology textbooks still reference the Bartlett case as an anomaly, a footnote that has never been satisfactorily explained. The question of how liquid chloroform entered Edwin Bartlett's stomach without burning his throat has never been answered. Theories have been proposed across a century and a half of advancing science. From the suggestion that Edwin was so heavily sedated by other drugs that his swallowing reflexes were suppressed, to the possibility that the chloroform was administered as a vapor that condensed in the stomach, to the recent hypothesis that Edwin drank it voluntarily, having been told it was a medicine, in a single gulp that bypassed the sensitive tissues of the throat. None of these explanations has been conclusively demonstrated. The mystery persists because Adelaide Bartlett is not available to resolve it. She took the answer with her when she disappeared. Sir James Paget's quip hangs over the case like an epitaph that can never be completed. She should tell us how she did it. But Adelaide Bartlett owed nothing to science, nothing to the public that had gawked at her suffering and debated her guilt over breakfast. She had been accused, tried, and acquitted. The system had done its worst, and she had survived. What she did with her survival was her own business. In a documentary about women trapped by legal systems and destroyed by courtroom judgments, Adelaide Bartlett represents the purest and most radical, not acquittal, which left Minnie Wallace free but visible, forever shadowed by suspicion. Not imprisonment, which consumed Florence Maybrick's best years and left her with nothing but poverty and silence, but erasure, the complete, deliberate, permanent rejection of the terms on which the world wanted to know her. She is a ghost in the archive, a blank space where a life should be. And that blank space is perhaps the most eloquent statement any of these women ever made about the system that tried to define them. Hashtag Act 4, What the Dead Left Behind, hashtag Chapter 10, 3 women, 3 verdicts, 1 system. Minnie Wallace died in her bed at 87, Florence Maybrick died in poverty at 79, and Adelaide Bartlett was never seen again. These endings are the system's final judgment on the women who passed through it, and like every other judgment the system rendered, they had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Minnie Wallace Walkup, the woman most likely to have committed murder, lived the longest and most comfortable life. After the suspicious death of her third male companion in 1914, she settled into a quiet existence that lasted more than 4 decades. She lived in comfort. She traveled when she wished. She answered to no one. She died in 1957 at the age of 87, in a country that had fought 2 world wars, invented the automobile and the airplane, split the atom, and built suburbs since the day she first purchased arsenic in Emporia. She had outlived every person who had accused her, every juror who had acquitted her, and every journalist who had covered her trial. Her obituary, if one was published at all, mentioned none of it. She died as an elderly woman in a century that had forgotten what she had done, in a world that could barely comprehend the legal architecture that had made it possible. Florence Maybrick, the woman most likely innocent, suffered the most. After her release from prison in 1900, she returned to America and spent the next 37 years in grinding poverty. She lived in a series of modest homes in Connecticut, surviving on small sums from distant relatives and the occasional payment from journalists and writers who found her story compelling enough to compensate. She became a recluse. She hoarded newspapers and magazines until her small cottage was nearly impassable. The rooms narrowed to pathways between stacked paper. She refused most visitors. She trusted no one. She had learned in the most brutal way possible what trust could cost. She died on October 23, 1941, at the age of 79. She died in a country at war, in a world that had moved so far beyond the Victorian certainties that destroyed her that her story seemed like ancient history. She died without ever being formally exonerated. The commutation of her death sentence was not a pardon. In the eyes of English law, Florence Maybrick died a convicted murderer. Adelaide Bartlett simply was not there. She had no recorded death, no recorded life after 1886, no grave that anyone has ever found. She exists in the historical record as an absence, a woman-shaped outline in the archive where a complete biography should be. 3 outcomes. 1 system. The woman who performed innocence most skillfully was rewarded with freedom and wealth. The woman who transgressed sexually was punished regardless of the evidence. The woman who refused to play the game at all was allowed to disappear because the system, having failed to convict her, had no further use for her. The verdicts were never about evidence. They were about obedience. They measured not what these women did, but how well they conformed to the expectations of men who held the power of life and death in their hands and on their jury ballots. Minnie Wallace conformed brilliantly. Florence Maybrick refused to conform. Adelaide Bartlett rendered the entire question irrelevant by vanishing before the system could assign her a permanent role. And the husbands? The men who died? They are footnotes in their own murders. James Walkup is remembered not for his years as mayor of Emporia, but for the manner of his death. James Maybrick is remembered not for his cotton brokerage, but for the arsenic in his stomach. Edwin Bartlett is remembered not for his grocery business, but for his bizarre domestic arrangements and the impossible chloroform in his belly. the system consumed them too. It turned them from human beings into evidence, from fathers and businessmen into exhibits in trials that were never really about them at all. Chapter 11. The Court That Came Too Late. Florence Maybrick's wrongful conviction helped build something she would never benefit from, the right to appeal. The outcry over her case was not merely emotional, it was structural. The Maybrick trial exposed a flaw in the English legal system so fundamental that it could no longer be ignored. In 1889, a person convicted of murder in an English court had no right to appeal. None. The verdict of the jury was final. If the judge was biased, if the evidence was insufficient, if the summing up was prejudicial, if the jury deliberated for 38 minutes on a capital case, there was no mechanism for correction. The only recourse was a petition to the Home Secretary, a political official with no obligation to act and every incentive to avoid controversy. Florence Maybrick's case made the absurdity of this system impossible to defend. Here was a woman convicted on ambiguous medical evidence, after a summing up by a judge whose mental fitness was in visible decline, whose conviction was protested by 500,000 citizens. With no path to have the verdict reviewed by a higher court, the system had no corrective mechanism for its own errors. It could only produce verdicts. It could not fix them. The reform took 18 years. The Court of Criminal Appeal was established in England in 1907, providing for the first time a formal process by which criminal convictions could be reviewed and overturned on grounds of legal error, insufficient evidence, or procedural unfairness. Florence Maybrick was not its sole catalyst. Other miscarriage of justice cases contributed to the pressure, but her case was the one that lodged in the public memory, the example cited most frequently in parliamentary debates, the name that journalists invoked when arguing that the system was broken beyond repair. She was released in 1904, 3 years before the court that might have freed her came into existence. The timing is the cruelest detail of her story. The system she helped reform was built too late to save her. The legal architecture of coverture eroded more slowly. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed in England in 1882 and in various American states throughout the 1880s and 1890s, began the long process of granting wives the right to own property, keep their wages, and maintain independent legal identities. These reforms did not arrive because legislators suddenly recognized the injustice of coverture. They arrived because cases like the ones in this documentary made the consequences of the old system impossible to ignore. Each poisoning, each trial, each petition added weight to the argument that a legal system trapping women in marriages without financial autonomy or legal recourse was a system manufacturing its own criminals. The reform was not driven by philosophy. It was driven by body counts. Other cases from the same era reinforced the pattern. In 1898, Cordelia Botkin of San Francisco mailed a box of poisoned candy to the wife of her former lover in Dover, Delaware, killing the woman and a dinner guest who shared the chocolates. The case demonstrated that arsenic's reach extended beyond the marital bed and into the postal system. In 1917, the Flagler-Bingham case in Palm Beach provided a gender-reversed mirror. A wealthy man whose young wife died under suspicious circumstances, illustrating that the intersection of marriage, money, and sudden death was not confined to one sex or one direction of power. But the essential lesson remained the same across every case and every courtroom. When a legal system offers people no legitimate exit from an intolerable situation, some of them will find an illegitimate one. When the cost of that illegitimate exit is 10 cents and the reward is a fortune, the only surprise is that it did not happen more often. The reforms that followed were real, but incomplete. Coverture was dismantled piece by piece across decades. Divorce became gradually more accessible. Women gained property rights, custody rights, and financial independence. The legal cage that Lydia Sherman and Minnie Wallace and Florence Maybrick had inhabited was disassembled, plank by plank, nail by nail, over the course of a century. but it was never fully demolished, and the ghost of its architecture still haunts the world we live in today. Hashtag Chapter 12, the system that was never acquitted. The question this documentary has been asking is not whether these women killed their husbands, because that question misses the point entirely. Minnie Wallace probably killed James Wallace. The evidence is strong, the pattern across 3 decades is damning, and her subsequent career of collecting estates from dying men suggests a woman who had learned a profitable skill and saw no reason to stop practicing it. Florence Maybrick probably did not kill James Maybrick. The medical evidence was weak, the alternative explanation of chronic self-poisoning was plausible, and the conviction was driven by moral outrage rather than forensic proof. Adelaide Bartlett's guilt or innocence is genuinely unknowable. The forensic puzzle she left behind may never be solved. She took the truth with her when she disappeared into the London fog. But the guilt or innocence of individual defendants is not the subject of this story. The subject is the system that produced. Consider the architecture one final time. Coverture law stripped wives of legal personhood. They could not own property, earn independent income, or leave their marriages without catastrophic financial and social consequences. Dower law rewarded widows with exactly the autonomy that wives were denied: property, income, legal standing, social respectability, and freedom. And arsenic, available at any drugstore for the price of a loaf of bread, provided the bridge between the two states. 10 cents to cross from captivity to independence, 10 cents to transform a wife into a widow, 10 cents to become a person again. The system did not merely fail to prevent these murders, it incentivized them. It created a legal environment in which the most reliable path from dependence to independence ran through a coffin. It offered women no legitimate exit and then expressed shock when they found an illegitimate one. It built a cage, hung the key on the wall just outside the bars, priced that key at 10 cents, and then hanged the women who reached for it. Or imprisoned them for 15 years, or allowed them to disappear. The response varied. The architecture that produced the need did not. The 10-cent packet of arsenic was not the weapon. It was the symptom. The weapon was the law itself. The weapon was a legal system that looked at a married woman and saw not a person, but a possession, not a citizen, but an appendage, not a human being with rights and agency, but a legal nonentity whose only path to personhood ran through her husband's grave. Return, for a moment, to those 2 numbers that contain the entire thesis of this documentary. 52 hours. That is how long the jury in the walk-up case deliberated before acquitting a woman against whom the evidence was substantial. They struggled, they argued, they wept. They could not send a 16-year-old girl to the gallows, no matter what she had done. 38 minutes. That is how long the jury in the Maybrick case deliberated before convicting a woman against whom the evidence was thin. They did not struggle, they did not argue, they did not need to. They had heard that she was an adulteress, and that was enough. The difference between those 2 numbers is not measured in hours. It is measured in the distance between a woman who performed femininity flawlessly and a woman who had committed the one sin that Victorian society could not forgive. Evidence was irrelevant. Obedience was everything. Any system that determines life and death, based not on facts but on how well the defendant performs submission, is not a justice system. It is a theater of control. And the Gilded Age courtroom was exactly that. A stage on which women were judged not for what they had done, but for what they were. Not for their actions, but for their compliance. Not for the evidence against them, but for the image they presented to 12 men who held their fates in their hands. This documentary has presented 3 women, 3 verdicts, and 3 outcomes. But the real defendant was never in the dock. The real defendant was the legal architecture that created the conditions for every case we have examined. Coverture, dower, the inaccessibility of divorce, the invisibility of arsenic, the absence of appellate courts, the the moral calculus that equated female sexuality with criminal capacity. These were not background conditions. They were the active machinery of injustice, the gears that turned and ground and produced, with mechanical reliability, exactly the outcomes we have witnessed. That system was never tried. It was never convicted. It was never sentenced. It was simply, slowly, incompletely reformed. The Married Women's Property Acts gave wives the right to own what they earned. The liberalization of divorce law gave them a way out of bad marriages that did not require a funeral. The Court of Criminal Appeal gave the wrongly convicted a mechanism for redress that Florence Maybrick never had. These reforms were real. They mattered. They changed lives, and they saved lives. But they did not arrive as justice. They arrived as damage control. They arrived because the body count became intolerable, because the petitions became too large to ignore, because the newspapers printed too many stories of women driven to desperation by a system that gave them no alternative. Reform came not from moral awakening, but from institutional embarrassment. The system was never acquitted of the charges this documentary has laid against it. It was merely paroled on the condition of better behavior. And here, at the end, we return to where we began. A 10-cent packet of arsenic, cheaper than a lawyer, more accessible than a divorce, more permanent than a petition. It sat on the shelf of every drugstore in America and every chemist in England, between the flour and the lamp oil, waiting to be purchased by any woman who had done the math and found that the cost of freedom was less than a dime. The question this documentary leaves you with is not whether these women were guilty. It is whether the system that produced them every